When it comes to the subject of sex and marriage, most of us are pretty uncomfortable talking about it. I think that's because of the extreme sanctity of sex and marriage. We shouldn't take it lightly. We should not talk about it lightly. Unfortunately, the world doesn't seem to share our high view of either sex or marriage. There are more sexual jokes in a stand-up comics routine than any other kind. There are more sexual themes on television and in the movies than any other kinds of themes. Marriage is treated as a joke by Hollywood and by TV and the filmmakers around the world. Still, sex was created by God and therefore is holy, and marriage was ordained by God and is equally holy. I think it's healthy for us to have a certain reverence and therefore fear when talking about these subjects. Now today in our series on spirituality and sexuality, we come to a most sensitive subject: the misuse of sexuality in marriage. Now yesterday I focused on the abuse of sexuality through homosexuality, and the day before that on the abuse of our sexuality through heterosexuality. But today's focus is on the abuse of our sexuality within the bonds of marriage. Perhaps you've never thought of this aspect of abuse before, but it happens daily between married couples around the world. So let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now you remember this is the portion of Paul's epistle to the Corinthians where he begins to address specific questions that were asked of him by the Corinthian church. Notice how he begins in verse 1. Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me. You see, Paul is now answering questions that were written to him from the Corinthian believers. And one of the first questions he has to deal with is the advisability of marriage. Should a man and a woman marry? Was the celibate life a better life? Given the sin that was so prevalent in this wicked city, was it not better for the Corinthians to simply give themselves to God and stay away from sex? After all, it was the worship of the goddess Aphrodite and her temple of 1,000 religious prostitutes on top of the mountain behind the city of Corinth. That's what caused the people of Corinth to be so immersed in all kinds of licentious, sexual practices. Some of those practices had even crept into the church. Remember, Paul in chapter 5 of this epistle addresses a man in the church of Corinth who was involved in an incestuous relationship with his stepmother. Given the penchant of this city for sexual perversion, some Corinthian believers had apparently come to believe that celibacy and dedication to God was preferable to domestic life and dedication to God. So how does Paul deal with the subject? Well, he attacks it head on. He says, "It is good for a man not to touch a woman." Now, we don't want to misunderstand Paul here. Paul is not trying to dissuade the Corinthians from marriage. In fact, his conclusion will be just the opposite. But as is his usual practice, Paul sets forth a general principle, and then he continues by doing one of three things. Either he expands the principle, or he restricts it, or he presents the converse side to that principle. Now, the general principle is that it is good, or perhaps better, it is acceptable for a man not to touch a woman. The word good is a relatively bland word, which seems to mean that it's certainly acceptable for a man to choose a celibate life, or it's certainly acceptable for a woman to choose a celibate life. Choosing not to marry is okay. But Paul doesn't want us to think that remaining celibate is somehow holier than getting married. It isn't. What is holier is finding God's will in our lives and then doing it. So it's all right if we choose not to marry. That squares with God. But since most of us do marry, Paul immediately continues to present the converse side to the issue. Listen to what he says. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. That's verse 2. Now, I think I need to address immediately what appears to be a very poor motivation for marriage. Do we marry only to prevent sexual immorality? Is that the purpose of marriage? Of course not. Writing on this verse, John Calvin points out that the first marriage, that of Adam and Eve, could not have been a remedy for a malady such as sexual immorality, because sin didn't even exist at that time. No, there are much higher purposes to marriage, but that's not our major concern here. What we're concerned with here is spirituality and sexuality, and specifically what the abuse of sexuality within a marriage does to our spirituality. Now, Paul has already begun to focus on the issue. He says we are no more spiritual nor less spiritual if we choose not to marry. Remaining single does not enhance spirituality, nor does getting married destroy it. But within the marriage bond, there is a way to quench our spiritual growth, and that's how we treat our spouse sexually. Now, let's get right to the real issue here. Paul is presenting the flip side to celibacy, and he says for all of us who are married, 3 principles must be true if we're to maintain our spirituality along with our sexuality. Here they are. Number 1, we must be sexually active only with our own spouse. Number 2, we must live up to the sexual expectations of our spouse. And number 3, we must never engage in sexual deprivation for anything less than a spiritual reason. Now, I want to go back and look at each of these 3 separately, more carefully. If you're married today, you can only maintain your spirituality if you're faithful to your spouse. Having sex with anyone but your husband or your wife is like a cancer on your spiritual life. My friend, it'll eat away at your spirituality and finally destroy it. So Paul's first principle of not abusing sex within marriage is that each married person must maintain their spirituality by having sex only with their spouse. Now that's a given, and it's addressed elsewhere, and we'll address it again in this series of messages. So let's move on for today. Principle number 2. Principle 2 is that we must live up to the sexual expectations of our spouse if we're to maintain our spirituality. Now, I want to relieve you of the burden of worldly thinking right now. This verse has nothing to do, men, with your virility or your sexual prowess. It's far more spiritual than that. There are 3 reasons why our wives should expect us to live up to their sexual expectations. There are 3 reasons, ladies, why your husband expects you to live up to his sexual expectations. First, sexual expectations are normal. God created male and female and put within each of us a healthy desire for the other. What we must do is throttle that desire so we aren't living like animals, or those we see on television, which I guess is the same thing. Your spouse's sexual expectations are normal. When you married your husband, he had a right to certain sexual expectations from you, and vice versa for you husbands. Second, sexual expectations are not only normal, they're right. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4 makes mention of marriage being honorable in everything, and the bed undefiled. You see, within the confines of the marriage vow, your sexual expression to your spouse is holy, it's right, it's even spiritual. Whatever is moral and ethical, and whatever your spouse and you mutually agree is moral and ethical, is right sexually. And perhaps that's the key, mutuality. It's normal, it's right, it's mutual. That's the third principle. Sexual expectations are mutual. You see, husbands have certain expectations of wives, and wives do of husbands as well. You need to come to some mutual agreement about those expectations. Notice in the next verse, verse 4, when we enter into a marriage relationship, we become a blended person. Now, I believe that's the meaning of becoming one flesh. You ever wondered about that? You ever wondered what God means when he says a man and a woman join together and become one flesh? I think that's the meaning. The husband hands over the right of his body to his wife, and the wife hands over the right of her body to her husband. They become one, mutually enjoying the relationship with the other. They blend, and they become one couple instead of two people. So married couples need to fulfill the sexual expectations of their spouse. Those expectations are normal, they're right, they're mutual. But what does this have to do with spirituality? Well, that's a good question, and here's the answer. Look at verse 5. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again so that Satan doesn't tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now you remember I said that there were 3 principles Paul sets forth with regard to marriage as opposed to celibacy. We're to have sexual relations only with our own spouse. We're to live up to the sexual expectations of our spouse. And now the 3rd principle. We are never to engage in sexual deprivation for anything less than a spiritual reason. You see, the abuse of sex within marriage happens right at this point. Now, maybe you've never thought of this before, but I want you to give serious thought about it now. It's acceptable to God for you to withhold sex from your spouse, but only if certain conditions are met. What are those conditions? Well, notice what he says right here. First of all, mutual consent. You see, depriving your spouse of sex is never the decision of one partner. Secondly, a determined time. Sexual deprivation in marriage is never open-ended. It doesn't go on forever. And thirdly, a spiritual reason. The reason is for prayer and fasting. Now, some manuscripts do not say fasting, but I think that's true nonetheless. It's a spiritual thing. You see, we never withhold sex from our partner unless it's by mutual consent, unless it's for a determined time, and unless it's for some good spiritual reason. Some people who claim to be spiritual use sex as a weapon against their spouse. Now, wives, if your husband leaves his dirty clothes lying on the floor, it's not spiritual to punish him by withholding sex. That's unspiritual, in fact. And husbands, if your wife does something that displeases you, you're never at liberty to punish her by abusing her sexual expectations of you. You see, sexuality and spirituality do go hand in hand. They're not antithetical to each other. They're not mutually exclusive. And still, the abuse of sexual expectations within marriage is a sure way to kill a marriage. Sexual deprivation for the wrong reason is the fast track to spiritual deprivation. If you want to see how your sexuality and your spirituality go hand in hand in marriage, just remember that God put you and your wife, or you and your husband, together to become one flesh, to be blended people, to be a couple. And when you deprive your partner of what is rightfully, normally, and mutually acceptable to him or her, you have become less than spiritual. Now, let's be honest. We have to be absolutely honest in our relationship with our spouse. Let's be spiritual as well. We have to be absolutely spiritual in that relationship. When a husband and a wife express mutual consent, neither of them has lost control. Oh no. What we've become is blended in our control, and that's the way it should be.